Hey everyone, welcome back to Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults by a young adult to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. Hey everyone, I'm so happy you all are back to join me for episode 8 of Project Honesty. If you are on Project Honesty's Instagram, Project_Honesty24, you would know that I put up a little poll yesterday asking you guys what you think today's topic is. If you guessed it right, congratulations. If you didn't, then that's okay, because you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about homelessness. We're going to be talking about the homelessness crisis. We're going to be talking about levels of homelessness, why homelessness has been on the rise, general factors that contribute to homelessness, statistics around racialized groups, as well as women and girls. And then we're also going to discuss homelessness in the media and things that I've seen and things that have been happening and ways to support homeless people. In today's episode, I will specifically be discussing statistics around Canadian homelessness and homelessness crisis in Canada. So if you live somewhere else, statistics may vary. But this episode is based on Canadian information, Canadian data. First, I want to get into the levels of homelessness. Now, this is something I actually learned while making this episode because I actually didn't know it existed. I didn't know there was different levels of homelessness. I thought there was only the one. When we think of homelessness, we are thinking of absolute homelessness. It's a very common thing to think when we think of homelessness, absolute homelessness. That is when you're living in the streets, you're in encampments, or places that shouldn't or can't be inhabited by a human. So when you get the picture of homelessness, that's what most people are thinking. But there's also something called emergency sheltered homelessness. So that is people staying in overnight shelters. That could be DV shelters or family crisis centers. A very temporary, not solution, but a temporary aid for people who do not have a home. There's also something called provisionally accommodated homelessness. So this is often referred to as hidden homelessness. You'll hear me talk about that later on in the episode. That is people that are like couch surfers. So you're not paying rent. You're under a roof technically, but it's not your home. And the residence that you are in is not guaranteed. It was not your permanent residence, and therefore it is temporary. Those are just kind of the different levels of homelessness and different ways people can experience homelessness. We're also going to get into now why homelessness has been on the rise and just the general factors that contribute to homelessness and how that can put people on the streets. One of the biggest examples, especially in Canada, for a leading factor in homelessness is the economic situation. Inflation, rising housing costs, living costs in general, like groceries, have been a major player in why people are not able to have a home. With this economic decline, there comes less work opportunities. And so without work, without pay, and high living costs, it is definitely a way people have started to become homeless now, going through a little bit, I would say a little bit of a recession. Definitely is a big contributing factor into why people have been going to the streets. When looking at more general factors and players in homelessness and why people are going to the streets, comes from many different things. One of the factors can be systematic issues, so discrimination based on race, gender identity, sexual orientation, privilege, things like that can all impact whether or not you have a job. And having a job nowadays is pretty important to being able to survive and live and afford to live. And so these systematic issues can be really detrimental to people who fall under that umbrella of discrimination. Another factor that is more commonly talked about is the mental health issues and mental health issues that are faced by homeless people. Especially after the pandemic, we have seen a rise in these mental health issues, but these issues can also be putting people on the streets. It ties back into why we're in an opioid opioid crisis, people using drugs and alcohol to cope with their mental health, which is a very unhealthy way to cope with mental health because they're not finding enough support to care for their mental health. So they rely on substance abuse to temporarily cope with their mental health, and that can definitely put them on the street. Thinking of a drug we've hopefully all heard of by this point is fentanyl, and the problem with fentanyl now and how deadly fentanyl can be, and the problems that it's causing in homelessness, in homeless encampments. And so mental health is definitely important to discuss when talking about homelessness. Another big and well discussed factor of homelessness is domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Statistics from 2021 done in Canada have shown that 36.9% of homeless people have become homeless due to relationship issues. And another statistic around that is 13.3% of those people are also escaping abuse. And this is a very common pathway for homeless people, but specifically women. 20.9% of women compared to 5.2% of men were homeless due to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So those factors cover just general homelessness. And those statistics are taken from people that are suffering from either provisional accommodation homelessness, emergency sheltered homelessness, and absolute homelessness. But when we isolate and take data from women who are suffering absolute homelessness, 40.4% of women who have experienced or are experiencing absolute homelessness have reported that it was due to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. When putting that into a ratio, that is 2 in 5 women who have experienced absolute homelessness in Canada. That number is alarmingly big, and it shouldn't be that big, but it is, unfortunately. And that definitely is a sad statistic to analyze and something that as a society we should be focusing on and working on. When looking at stats for racialized groups on the streets in Canada, 6.97% of homeless people in urban areas, so cities, are Indigenous or identify as Indigenous. But as a cover, 31% of homeless people in Canada in general experiencing all types of homelessness have at least some Indigenous ancestry. Again, in later episodes, we will discuss why more Indigenous people are ending up on the streets. With stats going back into women, a woman is killed every 6 days in Canada due to domestic violence. And this statistic is 6 times more likely to happen for Indigenous women. That is alarming, again, and that is another reason why domestic violence is a leading factor in women ending up on the streets. Overall, 19.1% of homeless Canadians belong to a racialized group. Whether that's the BIPOC community, Indigenous people, those 19.1% of those racialized and marginalized groups belong to the group of homeless Canadians. A thing I really wanted to talk about on here was homeless women and girls, and we already covered how domestic violence is a driving factor for women and girls ending up on the street. And during my research, I found stats that are showing how many women tend to end up on the street. Those statistics are actually quite inaccurate because women and girls are more susceptible to hidden homelessness. So that's the couch surfing, that's the temporary residence, that's the not paying rent. Those are some of the more common ways women and girls have been experiencing homelessness. To accompany that, 699 women with their accompanying 236 children are refused from domestic or family crisis centers every single day across Canada. That's almost 700 women and their children being refused from shelter. These crisis centers and these domestic violence shelters are fuller or at capacity compared to earlier years. This is again due to the pandemic, rising housing costs, inflation, and just the economy in general. So when we see women and girls entering homelessness, they are more likely to suffer from human trafficking compared to homeless males. This can also be sex trafficking and things that affect women a lot when they're on the streets. And even women that are not on the streets can be affected by human trafficking. I think it's important to bring that up. With that statistic, this can lead to fear of homelessness. So it leads these women who are escaping their violent home life, they instead return to their abusive living situation just so they can eat, have a roof over the head, and if they have children, that is a way to provide for their children. And this is really dangerous. This is a contributing factor in why domestic violence cases across Canada against women have been really high and on the rise, is because these women don't want to be homeless with a child, so they instead accept or take the abuse to make sure that they are providing for their children, which is quite sad, especially when they get denied from shelters. To cap it off, when discussing homelessness, you get a lot of your information from the media, and homelessness in general has a very negative tone to it, and I think it's disappointing that as a society and our government and our news sources are not covering how we can actually address and aid these problems. They instead feed into them and don't try to fix them. So what I've seen recently in the media is police and law enforcement going into encampments and destroying them, then leaving these people that were living in those encampments nothing and having no plan to relocate them elsewhere or somewhere safer. That is very disappointing, and I know that these encampments can be very dangerous, especially when it comes to drugs. But some of these encampments can save lives. Some people living in encampments need that shelter and need that community. And so I think without a relocation plan, police going in to destroy encampments is horrific and it shouldn't be happening. And the media forgets a lot that these people aren't just homeless people. They are people. They're struggling. And I think we need to help them more. There have definitely been a lot of projects piloted in Canada to work towards ending homelessness, and I think they're really, really great. And I think they could work if the government paid attention to them. With homelessness in the media, it's not necessarily media, it's just things I've seen around in my life. As an example, I take the train to the downtown core of the city that I live in often. I do that a lot, a couple times a week, and I like to look out the train window as I head to where I'm going. And I have noticed over the past month specifically that there is a lot of homeless people on the streets, and this is increasing at alarming rates. And these people aren't getting help. These people are cold, hungry. There's a group of homeless people that tend to hang around this certain Tim Hortons that my train passes, and it's really sad to see that they're in that situation and not getting help for it. When it comes to drugs on the streets, I've seen needles that are openly lying around, just cap open. And I've also seen people who may be struggling with withdrawals or overdose on the streets. And I can only identify that because I have gotten my Canadian Red Cross certification in first aid. And in that, I got a little bit of opioid training on top of that. And so I got the tools to identify an overdose. And I've definitely seen it a lot in the streets. And it is scary to see that, especially at a young age. It hurts my heart a little bit that that's happening. And partially why I got my Red Cross certification is that I can help in those situations, medically, temporarily assist them. When it comes to overdose, you can carry something called Narcan. If you live in Canada, you can go to any pharmacy and get Narcan. It will come in different forms depending on where you live, but Narcan or naloxone is an overdose drug that temporarily replaces the drugs in your brain receptors so that it stops an overdose for 15 to 30 minutes. That is enough time to get someone to a hospital. And I think Narcan is really good to carry around. I carry it around everywhere that I go, and I think it's important to have. I've luckily never had to use it. That is something I never want to use. I want to keep my Narcan closed. A thing that I've heard people say a lot on social media, and it's kind of sad to hear them say this, is that, oh, I don't give money to homeless people because I don't want them to use my money on drugs or alcohol. But those same people will go home and have a glass of wine or a beer. And so the class-based discrimination is sad. I don't think there should be that discrimination based on class. We all need help in many different ways in our life if we think about it. And I don't think that the blanket statement that all homeless people are going to buy drugs or use alcohol is something that we should stop thinking all the time. These people are struggling, and anything to give them will help. Speaking of help, what can we do to help people who are experiencing homelessness? A big one is supporting or volunteering and promoting the shelters or support services that help people facing homelessness. So food services, clothing services, shelters, things like that. You can donate clothes or grocery items to local charities that aid homeless people. And just in general, make sure that we're having an open and honest conversation with real facts around homelessness and the facts about homelessness in Canada. This episode, like I said earlier, is kind of just the beginning of diving into Indigenous issues in Canada. This episode is something, or these episodes, I guess I should say, are something that I've been looking forward to for a while now, and I'm excited to start the series because the next 2 or 3 episodes will be all about Indigenous issues in Canada. We're going to get into Indigenous women, Indigenous issues when it comes to the federal government, but we're also going to go back in time and look at the Indian Act, things like that. I don't want to spoil too much, but we're going to get into stuff like that in the next 2 or 3 episodes. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. And to keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24. To help spread this podcast everywhere, tell a friend. Share with your friends or your family about Project Honesty and direct them over to either the Instagram, Spotify, or YouTube to help them learn more about what we do here at Project Honesty. Because the more listeners, the bigger the family. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.